Crimea is heavily dependent on fresh water from the Dnieper River and electricity from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear facility. And therefore it was a priority when Russia invaded Ukraine to seize that facility. The challenge, of course, is that nuclear power plants are actually protected. They cannot be targeted. And instead, Russia has actually used this large, sprawling power plant in Europe in which to hide equipment and also military personnel, which is in direct contravention of the Geneva Convention.
The situation on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, which is the largest nuclear plant in Europe, remains very dangerous. And of course, when we are hearing reports from President Zelensky, we are getting much more worried. It is unprecedented that Russia is not letting UN watchdog into specific places inside the station to make the checks on what is actually going on. But I can tell you that in Ukraine for the last 2 weeks there has been specific trainings for people in the territories near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant and in Kiev and in other cities, trainings like how to act during the nuclear attack.
Now, Russia would have expected to subjugate the whole of Ukraine very quickly in a matter of weeks. As it happens, what's happened now, they're on the defensive. It looks very likely Russia's going to have to cede territory, and therefore there's a grave risk that Zaporizhzhia actually becomes a liability for Russia. According to Ukraine's main Department of Intelligence in the Ministry of Defense, Russian military personnel are leaving the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Now, the harsh reality is this has not been verified. It could be because the Russians are actually preparing for battle, and what they're doing is getting rid of any extraneous personnel from the nuclear facility. But it could be that Russia is actually drawing down its military personnel because following Prigozhin's sort of march for justice the other week, Russian priorities might be more towards domestic security than keeping track of the nuclear facility. It's also worth pointing out, though, that Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant is right at the northern edge of Russian-occupied territory in Ukraine. So if Ukraine does make any significant breakthrough on the front line, there's a grave risk that any Russian forces at the power plant will become isolated and therefore extremely vulnerable. There's been widespread reports that Russia has mined the Zaporizhzhia nuclear facility. Now, Russia does have a track record of leaving a trail of devastation in its wake, as it did with the Kharkovka dam and all the immense flooding that followed that. But it's unlikely that Russia would actually want to destroy the nuclear power plant itself, because this would have immensely long-term consequences. Putin retains long-term imperialist ambitions, and although the war in Ukraine isn't going particularly well for him at the moment, he will be looking to the long game, and if he destroyed the nuclear plant, that would leave devastation for generations to come. Much more likely is Russia will look to set traps and destroy part of the supporting infrastructure, the cooling systems, the electricity, because that would cause a massive distraction for the oncoming Ukraine forces, and also raise the spectre of a nuclear incident, which of course potentially could buy Russia time. Nuclear reactors are incredibly well protected. However, the supporting infrastructure, the cooling reactors, the electricity supplies, are much more vulnerable and could potentially be targeted for the Russian withdrawal. Now, one option for the Ukrainians is an all-out assault on the nuclear facility to eject the Russians out of it. One of the problems there is it inevitably involve a lot of explosions in the plant itself, and potentially Russia could blame Ukraine for any damage that was done to the nuclear reactor. A second option, much more likely, is that Ukraine will look to encircle the reactor, isolate the forces within the facility, and then negotiate with the Russians to let them leave. That's almost certainly the safest and most cost-effective way of liberating the nuclear plant and getting it back safely into Ukrainian hands.